Donald Trump has always said he'll be tough on China, and now he's signed a deal with Beijing. He says it will correct what he calls the mistakes of the past. But is this really the beginning of the end of the trade war between the U.S. and China? And who stands to gain or lose? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Richelle Carey. After more than 2 years of escalating tariffs and a seemingly never-ending trade war, the U.S. and China have agreed on a first step towards a truce. If it holds, it could be a boost for U.S. President Donald Trump in an election year. But who will benefit the most from this initial phase of a broader trade agreement? China has promised to open up its markets and buy more U.S. goods. In exchange, the U.S. will lift some tariffs. Yet most will stay in place, and that's where the problems start. We'll get to our discussion with our guest shortly. First, Mike Hanna reports.
It was a lavish White House ceremony, crowded with cabinet members, lawmakers, and executives from large U.S. corporations. President Trump hailed the deal as remarkable.
Today we take a momentous step, one that has never been taken before with China, toward a future of fair and reciprocal trade as we sign phase one of the historic trade deal between the United States and China. Together we are righting the wrongs of the past and delivering a future of economic justice and security for American workers, farmers, and families.
Sentiments echoed by China's signatory to the deal.
中美两国从大局出发
China and the United States, with the larger picture in mind, have taken a serious approach to our differences and worked to manage them appropriately, reaching the Phase 1 trade agreement. It is good for China, for the United States and the world.
The reality, though, that this is just an initial deal and many problematic issues in the U.S.-China relationship remain unaddressed.
I think that it has moved the needle a little bit with China, and it has made some progress, but at the same time, I don't think that it achieves the fundamental structural changes that are going to need to happen for the U.S. tech sector in particular to really feel comfortable.
President Trump's political opponents insist he's been outsmarted by his Chinese counterpart.
I greatly fear that President Xi is laughing at us behind our backs for having given away so little at the expense of American workers, farmers, and businesses. The administration, in order to get a deal at all costs before the 2020 election, has thrown the American worker and American business overboard, and they're going to be the ones left to face the consequences.
Amidst the smiles and celebrations, the awareness that this is not an end to the trade war, it is at this stage merely a truce. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's bring in our guests now in Beijing. We have Wang. She's an analyst for the Economist Intelligence Unit's Access China Service. In Stockholm on Skype, we have Hosuk Lee-Makiyama. He is director of the European Center for International Political Economy and a former Swedish representative to the World Trade Organization. And in New York, Phil Caruso. He's a member of the Defense Council at the Truman National Security Project and a former intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force. Welcome to all of you. I'm going to start with you, Dan. How would you characterize this new deal, this new agreement?
Well, to me, this is a very shallow deal still in its essence, because basically it's about China committing to buy more stuff from the U.S. And in a way, it is a mission impossible because there's no way that China can buy this $200 billion from the U.S. without jeopardizing its relationship with other trading partners. And at the same time, China also said it won't increase the domestic fiscal subsidies, and it can achieve this goal in the trade deal at the same time. And those two things cannot be done simultaneously either. So in any case, I think this is actually more a win to the U.S. side rather than to China.
Okay. Hosuk, you have described this as a ceasefire more than a deal. How so?
Well, It is a very short and a shallow agreement, but it's also a start of an agreement. It's more of an opening a process that will actually allow United States and China to actually work towards a more comprehensive deal. And in that sense, this is a very, very un-American trade agreement in the sense that traditionally US trade agreements focus on comprehensive outcomes with balanced and ambitious outcomes in all chapters. Whereas what we are seeing now is basically a framework in order to stop trade retaliations against each other.
Phil, how would you characterize this deal, this agreement?
I would say that in the short term, it's a win for both President Xi and President Trump. President Xi is facing multiple crises at home in Hong Kong, a recent election in Taiwan, international criticism over Xinjiang, and economic issues, including a corporate debt bubble and a slowdown. President Trump is obviously in an election year and wants to claim a big win on the economy ahead of the election. And to also to create a ceasefire that would prevent anything happening to the U.S. economy in the time between now and the election. But over the long term, I think this is more of a win for China than for the United States, and certainly for the American people. I think the deal failed to address some of the most pernicious issues that are affecting the bilateral trade relationship, including national security issues like cybersecurity. And I also think over the long term, what the deal has done, what the trade war has done more broadly, is call into question the ability for Chinese companies to rely on the United States for agricultural products and for critical components for technology, which has created incentives and a focus at home in China to be able to develop internal domestic supplies of those types of products and to shift trade relationships elsewhere. Soy, for example, is one of the United States' largest exports to China historically. A lot of those producers, in the United States, while they were sitting idle, were losing business to Brazil and other countries that are providing those products. And those trade relationships that have been established will continue to exist. And so United States companies and farmers will be less competitive over the long run because China is sourcing those supplies and components elsewhere.
So do you think farmers will see it that way, that this really perhaps doesn't benefit them the way that Donald Trump has tried to present it? And clearly, during this trade war, the farm industry has been subsidized because they have been losing. Phil?
Yeah, they've been subsidized, but not entirely. I mean, plenty of farmers have been hit very hard by this. A lot of logistics companies have been hit hard. And with the agreement itself, it provides 2 years of commitments. And even those commitments are called into question. Vice Premier Liu said that China would only buy what the market demands. And there's question over whether or not U.S. farmers could even provide the supplies that were agreed to in the trade deal.
So, Dan, I want to bring that back to you, something that you had also mentioned, that some of these numbers just don't seem realistic. So is it that China has no intention of honoring these numbers? And as Phil has said, some of these numbers just couldn't be achieved anyway. Why agree to something like this?
Well, this looks to me more of a tact to drag a bit longer and buy more time for China's domestic reform and financial opening up. Because for China, committing to this $200 billion in exchange for letting go of the December tranche of the tariff and having some of the existing tariff being halved, that is in a way a very good thing. And there is a saying called one bird in hand is better than two birds in the air. So for China, that is committing to something it's going to do in the next 2 years and exchange for something that's happening right now. In a way, this is a silver lining to committing this large number.
Hosuk, what does this mean for your America's allies? How have they been affected by this trade war between U.S. and China?
Well, the truth is that Germany in particular, but also France and the UK, has been extremely nervous and bending themselves backwards and offering concessions left and right to China because they had been anticipating probably much worse outcome for them than they expected. You have to remember that on the Chinese market, the biggest competitors that Europeans have are actually all American firms. So in that sense, actually, this could be a crucial blow to European competitiveness. I think there is probably a lot of sigh of relief across the European continent right now. They're realizing that aside from the financial services and in agriculture, there's probably not that much that would actually threaten them in the short term. But also in the long term, we have to remember that China is now playing very assertive and asking for concession, particularly, for example, for Huawei and 5G companies, that they want to actually secure market access before they offer any kind of a reciprocal conditions or similar concessions as they have offered to the United States. In short, we can probably expect that, well, China is now taking over the agenda on EU-China relationship and using the Phase 1 agreement in order to basically exert as much concession as possible from Europe going forward.
Phil, you have said that there were a lot of things that weren't addressed when we're talking about intellectual property, tech, things like Huawei that maybe they're kicking the can down the road. But Donald Trump has tried to say that this situation between China and the U.S. is of national security interest. How so?
Well, I mean, so the United States and many other countries around the world have questions about Huawei and its connections to the Communist Party, its requirement to, under Chinese law, to comply with the Chinese government and security services, which creates an intelligence issue associated with the technology. But as far as the deal itself, the United States and China excluded the discussion of Huawei from the deal and separated it as a national security issue along with cybersecurity, which is what the United States wanted. But along with the deal, though, I mean, the deal itself it symbolizes, I think, a broader ceasefire and the bilateral issues for the rest of the year. And President Xi, in the letter that he wrote to President Trump that was read aloud during the signing ceremony yesterday, President Xi expressed that he expected that the United States would respect, free markets and Chinese investment. He even specifically cited the collaboration between Chinese academics and researchers in American universities, which has been another national security issue. So it's clear that although the deal itself doesn't deal with Huawei, I think it appears that the expectation of the Communist Party is that the U.S. is not going to be particularly aggressive against Huawei in the following months following this deal, even though there will continue to be incremental steps that the United States will take. The U.S. will probably continue to pressure allies over allowing Huawei to install 5G technology in their networks. But I think instead of the major blows, the larger steps the United States has taken over the past couple of years, I think we're going to see that progress or that pressure start to slow because President Trump does not want to call this deal into question over the next year.
And Dan, do you agree with that read?
Well, in a way I do, but at the same time, I'm not so optimistic about the tech future because, for example, TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporate, it is the only one that can produce this kind of processing chip that China really needs, especially Huawei, ZTE, those electronic companies, telecommunication companies. But TSMC is right now under huge pressure from the U.S. to stop supplying to China. So although on the surface, both sides seem to push the pause button, but behind it, the Made in China 2025 is still going on. The technology competition is still going on. And I just don't see how this can be solved just with a trade deal.
Hosuk, I could tell by the look on your face just a minute ago, you wanted to get in on this as well. Go right ahead.
Now, I think, first of all, it would be somewhat premature to assume that the trade deal would be linked to access with Huawei. I think traditionally, both for China and the United States, national security matters are very compartmentalized versus trade interest. We have to remember that link is very, very weak. I know for a fact that, Chinese leaders have accused the United States of protectionism, but there is a flaw in that argument in the sense that the United States doesn't actually have any manufacturers in this field. There is not a single U.S. manufacturer of 5G antennas. So it is probably the case that it's more likely that the issue will get linked into phase two towards US offensive interests, for example, like in telecom. China still applies a strict foreign equity cap on foreign investments in telecoms. Actually, all telecom companies are state-owned. I'm talking about the operators, not the manufacturing. And also, there is a very strict, rigorous licensing requirement for e-commerce and for cloud services. So it's more likely that, well, China will basically ask for a quid pro quo that these companies data processing, AI, and telecoms will be provided access in return for Chinese access to the U.S. markets.
Hosuk, I want to stick with you and ask you another question. The fact that this situation has developed over the last few years and really amped up under the Trump administration between China and the U.S., directly having these talks, directly trying to work out this deal, what do you think this says about the future for broader trade pacts, like things that have gone by the wayside, TPP, et cetera, et cetera? Is there any implication, a broader implication to you?
Well, first of all, I think the United States has taken a slightly different trade strategy compared to the past. This is not a typically American trade agreement. I would perhaps even call it more Asian. Asian trade agreements tend to focus on process, diplomacy, and let's say, a step-by-step approach, whereas the U.S. looking for a grand bargain. So in a sense, you can say that the United States have returned or turn towards a more Asian approach to trade agreements. And this is also, of course, extremely mercantilist, and you could even call it a managed trade deal rather than a free trade deal. It sets a lot of objectives. I think, unlike what we have heard from the other commentators, I think it is possible to reach up to these targets on counter purchases, simply because, well, China is currently, there's a huge demand for especially agri-food products. And on the second point, I think the most important part here is that United States have taken a really clearly unilateral approach where it has realized that the strategy of relying on allies like, for example, Japan and Australia and Canada in order to open up China is just diluting their interest. In other words, United States have taken a very deliberate stance on saying that they don't need a TPP agreement. They can actually go alone, and actually working with allies like Europe and other East Asian economies along the rims of the Chinese border will basically weaken United States interests, because they have to basically accommodate other allies into the agreement.
Phil, can the U.S. go it alone? I mean, what about this radically different approach from Donald Trump, and the fact that this is a bit of it just is intervening in a way that past presidents have not?
Yeah, so I don't think the United States can go it alone. And I agree with the point that historically economic and trade issues have been decoupled with national security and bilateral diplomatic issues over the course of past administrations. But I disagree that that's the case with the Trump administration. I think what the Trump administration has done and received a lot of criticism for, fairly in my view, is put everything on the table. When the U.S. took action against ZTE, a couple of years ago, President Trump explicitly relieved that pressure in part due to trade issues. And the issue with ZTE was national security in nature. But the real issue, as far as is the U.S. ability to face the national security threat with Huawei is its presence overseas and with allies. And the U.S. can't go it alone to deal with that problem, because the presence of Huawei in all those countries threatens the U.S. security, military, and intelligence relationships with those countries. So, for example, the U.S. has threatened to stop sharing intelligence with its allies, including in Europe, if they install Huawei 5G systems. And as far as bilateral trade, I mean, the Trump administration, when it pulled out of TPP, did say that it viewed bilateral agreements, and negotiating those agreements is more favorable than being in TPP. But the United States has not taken broad-based action to replace TPP with a comprehensive series of agreements. It's negotiated a few agreements with key trade partners like Korea and Japan, but TPP was much broader in the Pacific with a lot of different partners. And so the United States hasn't replaced TPP entirely, and it remains to be seen whether or not the Trump administration has plans to do so.
So Dan, what is this really about? I mean, is it really about trade? Is it about information? This battle between Donald Trump and China, what is it really about as you see it?
Well, right now, if we just look at this deal, it is actually very hard to figure out what Donald Trump wants from China, because in a way, it looks like it is almost a sanction to China by forcing it to buy so much stuff from the U.S. But at the same time, it also makes China the largest client for a lot of the U.S. domestic industries, manufacturing, energy, agricultural goods. And we all know that as the single largest customer, actually have a lot of say over suppliers. And over time, this is not a good trade deal for even the United States. And this certainly cannot be the ground for a larger scale trade deal, especially when it involves other countries. Because, Donald Trump's framework, it's basically a zero-sum game. He forced China to sign this by jeopardizing the interests of the U.S. allies. And there's also a political struggle here as well, because it will be complicated by China's relation with Taiwan, with Hong Kong, and also possibly with Iran. So this is a competition not just between trade, between information, finance, technology. It's also about the political power globally.
Hosuk, the markets weren't that thrilled about it. They seemed to be at first, but then it seemed that a lot of the rhetoric that Donald Trump had didn't actually match what was the devil was in the details. The market wasn't that excited about this. What do you think this is really about?
Aside from the fact that the United States have decided to go alone, it also marks an end to the multilateral trading system, meaning that it's not the rules and through a trade dispute under the rule of law, under the World Trade Organization, that's going to solve the matters going forward. Everything is up for negotiation, and basically it's all about quid pro quo. We are moving rapidly towards a more transactional environment. And so in that sense, this might have been United States' last chance to deal with the China problem. Whether it was the right deal that was struck or not, we will see perhaps for the few years down the line. But the big picture here is also, I think, that China is also very cornered. This has struck very hard on China's macroeconomics, but also in terms of self-confidence. It has found itself very much cornered without no real allies.
Might that have been Donald Trump's point?
I have no expertise to figure out what Donald Trump thinks.
Yes, sir.
I think U.S. trading, my expertise is in trade and not necessarily in psychology of world leaders. But I think if you look at what the trade negotiators were thinking, I think they were very much looking into this might be the last chance saloon as far as United States having some kind of leverage. And also, you have to remember that all these tit for tat we have seen over the past year is that you don't build out this much leverage without no intention of using it. It has to have an outlet. So I'm not surprised that the deal is struck, and I'm not very surprised that it's a very lightweight agreement. We have to remember that a free trade agreement usually runs in 1,000+ pages, and we are looking at less than 100, including annexes, in this completion of this document. And so, therefore, the real question is, what's the next step? What's phase 2 going to be like? Okay. And that's where the details are going to be really crucial.
And I'm sure we will have this discussion again when phase 2 comes out. And Hosuk, I will not again ask you to explain Donald Trump's thinking. Thank you all for the conversation. Appreciate it very much. Dan Wang, Hosuk, Lee-Makiyama, and Phil Caruso. Thank you. And thank you for watching the program. You can join us again anytime. Visit our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. Go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Richelle, Carey, and the entire team. Bye for now.